virus, where a few of us will speak for a few minutes and tell you something from their own experience or from their own life. And we will begin with Dr. Darvas from Hungary, who will not only tell about himself, but also about Hungary's history of the Jews, because on March 19, it was 70 years since the Germans entered there. Robbie.
Beautiful place, isn't it?
My name is Robert M. Darvas.
Mike.
Oh, okay. All right. Fair enough. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. Start it over. My name is Robert M. Darvas. I'm an Emeritus Professor of Architectural Structures at the University of Michigan. I was born in 1930 in Budapest, Hungary, and I am among the few, but unfortunately fast dwindling survivors and eyewitnesses of the Holocaust. And it was only by sheer luck, or was it the right alignment of the stars, I don't know, that I escaped from being deported and killed in one of the better or less known concentration camps, or being shot into the Danube River. Not by Germans, not by SS soldiers, but by Hungarian Nazis, the so-called Arrow Cross thugs. At the tender age of 14, for about 10 months, I was like a hunted animal who could be freely killed by any of the self-appointed but politically legitimated hunters. Yom HaShoah, the day of remembrance to the catastrophe. We select a day to remember the horror that had befallen on the European Jewry, which came to be known as the Holocaust. It was 70 years ago, in 1944, that the last chapter of the systematic annihilation of European Jewry began. This last chapter starts on March 19, 1944, when the Germans occupy Hungary and force the installation of an extreme far-right government. By that time, every sane person knew that Germany lost the war. The Allies were already deep in Italy. The Red Army was fast closing in on the Hungarian borders. Bulgaria, Romania, and Italy have already switched sides. And it was known that some Hungarians were also trying to find a way to get out of the hopeless situation. The Germans did not need an army, but only a few thousand troops to occupy Hungary. And with the German troops' arrival, followed by Adolf Eichmann, and just a few dozen SS troops who were the entrusted executors of the Endlösung, the final solution, the last chapter of the Holocaust in Hungary began. Anti-Semitism had always had deep roots in Hungary. Pogroms, blood libel stories were widespread in the 19th century, and the ruling nobility were always quick to blame on the Jews any sort of setback the country has suffered. The whole history of Hungary is replete with incomprehensible stories that denied responsibility for anything that befallen on the country by some very vocal provocateurs. The loss of freedom fight against the Habsburgs in 1848-49, the 19th century, was not caused primarily by the overwhelming Tsarist troops who came to the help of the Austrians, but by the international Jewish bankers by denying loans to the freedom-loving Magyars, Hungarians. The loss of World War I and the following peace treaty at Trianon was also somehow caused by the traitor Jews, who out of their hatred forced President Wilson, Clemenceau, and other leaders of the victorious Western countries to punish poor Hungary, the bastion of Christianity. In modern times, anti-Jewish laws, i.e., state-initiated and enshrined into the jurisprudence, have started as early as 1920 with the so-called numerus clausus law that limited the number of Jewish students at the universities and institutions of higher learning to 6%. This was followed in the second half of the 1930s by other anti-Jewish laws whose major aim was the squeezing out the Jews from many spheres of the economy, industry, commerce, recreation, entertainment, etc. The ideology in the underpinning of these actions was that the Jews were parasites, living upon the body of the pure and Christian nation, and for the nation to survive and rise again to be a great power, it is paramount to cleanse, or at least control the parasites that suck the blood of the nation. These are the words that were spread around and used openly. This phraseology was spoken in the parliament, declared from the pulpits by many clergymen, written and published in pamphlets and newspapers. Beginning in 1940, kids in the elementary and high schools were strictly separated into classes for Christians and separate for Jews, obviously to protect the pure Aryans, who might somehow be offended by breathing the same air or subverted by the simple presence of Jews in the same classroom. In the meantime, the systematic looting and expropriation of Jewish wealth went on unabated. Businesses, real estate, factories, restaurants were forced to be sold at fire sale prices, or just simply taken over by the state or its officials. The beneficiaries were officials, their relatives, and their friends. The mobilization following the entry of Hungary into World War II found the young Jewish males to be called into forced labor battalions, ostensibly adjuncts to the troops. These men were often at the mercy of sadistic commanders and guards who starved them, beat them, tortured them, and killed them at will, knowing full well that they have the blessing of the upper echelons of the army. Now, why are these few among many background details important? Because despite all these horrorful deprivations, indignities, and humiliations, until now, we Jews in Hungary were not yet victims of the mass deportations and exterminations that were the fate of most others who lived in other German-occupied countries. Until that fateful day of March 19, 1944, about 750,000 Jews lived in the country, including those who converted into Christianity but still counted as Jews on a racial basis by the so-called Second Jewish Law passed in 1939 that defined the Jews on a racial, not religious basis. Then within 8 weeks, starting May 15 through the 9th of July, about 450,000 who lived in the countryside were first collected in county-wide ghettos, then forced into boxcars, destination the Auschwitz-Birkenau death camp. The enthusiasm, efficiency, and the brutality with which the Hungarians executed the herding of the people into ghettos, hastily set up in brickyards and similar places, then within a few days onto the Auschwitz-bound trains, amazed even the Germans. 70 to 80 people were forced into each wagon without food or water or toilet facilities. The wagons were sealed from the outside. One tiny ventilation window provided their often last visual contact with the passing countryside. Now let's stop here for a second and analyze these happenings. Those deported people represented about 180 to 200,000 households, some of them middle class, many poor. But even the poor ones had some properties: clothing, pots, pans, furniture, household goods, items which were now free for the neighbors to loot. Then there were the houses and the apartments, into which they could move if their abodes were not as nice or desirable. Of course, there were strict formalities. The occupation of a formerly Jewish-owned housing unit had to be petitioned from the village or county or city officials. After all, Hungarians always were such law-abiding people. Nevertheless, but Christian Ungváry, a non-Jew, a well-known historian, calls it the greatest wealth transfer in the history of Hungary, was clearly a major motivation in the enthusiastic support the deportation of the Jews received by the great majority of the people. Were all Hungarians that way? No. There was perhaps less than 10 to 15% who actively participated in killing their fellow countrymen. And there was also perhaps another 10% or fewer who tried actively help the victims, who hid families, hid children, or otherwise helped to ease the misfortune of the Jews. The rest remained silent and gladly participated in benefiting in the misfortune of their neighbors. I hold as most guilty the members of the Christian clergy from the top down, who, with very few exceptions, not only remained silent, but spoke out, often from the pulpit, in support of the degradations and killings of Jews. Then all of a sudden, on July 7, 1944, oh, by the way, these 450,000 people were taken off the countryside in 7 weeks. Can you imagine that? 7 weeks, the organization. Then all of a sudden, on July 7, 1944, just as the state organization was gearing up for the ghettoization and deportation of the remaining approximately 200,000 Jews from Budapest, the regent suddenly ordered the stoppage of further deportations. It is still a mystery of why. Possibly the Allied landing in Normandy a month before, or the fast advancing Red Army from the east pushed him into action, or as it was rumored, he has received a personal message from President Roosevelt threatening him with future consequences. Regardless of the motivation, he finally acted and ordered an immediate stop to the deportations. And about 200,000 Jews essentially received a temporary suspension of their death sentences. a 3.5 months of uneasy calm took place in the Jewish community in Budapest. Then on October 15, another fateful event happened. By then, the Allies were sweeping over, liberating vast areas in Western Europe. Red Army troops were already in Hungarian territory on the east. That was the day that the regent, deciding finally about the futility and staying as the last ally of Germany, publicly sued for peace. Within a few hours, the far-right Arrow Cross Party, with the help of the Germans and many high-ranking Hungarian army officers, grabbed power. The following 3 months until the liberation of Pest, i.e. the east side of the city, was an unabated bloodbath among the Jewry in Budapest. A walled-in ghetto was set up in the 7th district with inadequate health care, horrible shortage of food and other supplies. Hundreds were dying daily. Another ghetto came into being, the so-called international ghetto. Neutral countries, Sweden with the leadership of Raoul Wallenberg, Switzerland, Spain and Portugal, started to provide Schutzpasses, so-called protection letters, established protected apartment buildings, since by then trains were not running, especially not in the easterly direction. They often collected large groups and started them on a death march along the highway leading toward Austria. Many of those who survived ended up in Mauthausen or other Austrian camps. Other groups that were collected were simply led onto the riverfront and shot into the river after robbing them from their last meager possessions like wedding rings and watches. To save on bullets, sometimes they were just tied together with rope or wire and pushed into the river. I almost ended up sharing a similar fate. One time, when a death squad collected a group, about 15 or 20 people, from the very building I lived in, a building that was under Spanish protection. Luckily, however, I happened to be out on an errand. Illegally, for the time was beyond curfew, and on top of that I was not wearing the mandatory yellow star. A 13-year-old friend of mine from the same building was not so lucky. He was taken and never heard of again, nor was anyone in that group. They became part of the 6 million who were murdered during the time when insanity ruled the world. Now you rightly ask, were those murderers, those who committed all these unspeakable crimes, ever brought to justice? The sad answer is this: at least in Hungary, with the exception of a few of the top leaders, no. After the war, the Communist Party in Hungary desperately needed mass support. Lo and behold, many of the Arrow Cross Party members suddenly transformed themselves into leftists, the ardent supporters of another extremist ideology. The Communist Party's policy was this: if we want to gain the support of the masses, we should not call upon them to admit responsibility for the crimes they committed. So for 40 years after the war, an unspoken denial of responsibility was the official policy. The Germans did everything. We were innocent. Hungary failed to confront and openly examine its past shameful history. And the last 25 years, since the collapse of the socialist dictatorship, but especially since the rise of the right-of-center Fidesz party came to rule, the denial of any responsibility is no longer silent. The claim is being made more and more loudly that if there was a